Now, a few more comments here about what we don't know for sure. It seems that, I mentioned before in Jude, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not keeping up with my slides here. This is Emmaus. This is an early picture of an agape meal. It's a very, very early picture. And it appears from Jude 12 that that was one of the ways in which, at least in some parts of the early communities, this common shared meal was talked about. In Jude 12, the concern is, by the way, with errant pastors who are somehow violating the supper. You know, it's interesting. Our concern is typically with what about the unbaptized and what about children? I mean, that's for us Anabaptist community. Jude 12 is a reminder that maybe nobody's really entitled to not ask themselves, am I a fitting participant here, including those of us who are pastors and teachers? Jude 12 is one of those verses you wish weren't there. When we think of Paul's words in 1 Corinthians, we see the beginnings, it appears, as a kind of separation of the common meal into a memorial moment. Eleanor Snyder, in her wonderful book, Communion Shapes Character, by the way, I would commend that book highly as a kind of almost encyclopedic gathering of Kreider. Thank you. Almost encyclopedia-like compendium of relevant texts. She talks about the symposium. By the way, symposium doesn't mean what we're doing here today. Symposium is drinking together. That's literally what that means. So a symposium is a drinking event in which speeches are given. I guess they watered down the wine enough so that the speeches remained interesting, or not, so that the audience wouldn't care. In any case, it looks like Paul is introducing, you know, when he says, why don't if you're hungry, eat at home. It's almost like wanting to say, let's make sure we keep the common meals, but let's make sure we have a moment in which we appreciate the full depth and significance of Jesus' death. Matthew seems to have a similar... Oh, I'm sorry. There's one point I wanted to make about this. I think it seems very much that Paul's assumption is that it is members of the body who need to be reminded of what it means to be the body. So this speaks very much in terms of covenanted members. Those who have been baptized into Christ are the ones Paul is addressing. Paul doesn't say anything about unbaptized or children, but the term body seems to presuppose that that's who he has in mind. Matthew may have a similar kind of concern when he attaches to his parable of the great banquet this mini parable of the person who shows up without wedding garments at the feast and gets chucked out. The Didache, or also known as the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, a late first century document which makes it pretty well contemporaneous with some of the later Gospels, quotes a line that we also find in Mark 7, when Jesus says to the Syrophoenician woman, "You should not give what is holy to the dogs." And we might wish to remind the author of Didache that the Syrian Phoenician woman won that argument with Jesus. Even the dogs get the crumbs. But what we see in these early documents already is some concern about what this supper means in relation to the notion of church. Children don't show up in these texts. That either means that it was assumed they were where their parents were. If we think, for instance, of the Passover as a prototype, then it's possible that children would have been present. But how long how and to what extent that held when circumcision was replaced by baptism, it's difficult for us to say. Now, here's a notion that for later discussion. It may be that if children participated in communion, they did so because they had no choice. In a patriarchal context, Dad determined what everybody did. So we might want to be just a little bit cautious about how we look to the first century for evidence. Yep, children took it. Because many of you would hardly want to also use that as an invitation to return to patriarchy. So that's one of the differences between our world and that world. Now, we know that eating together was a flashpoint from the beginning. You recall the argument Paul had with Peter in Antioch, which Paul himself tells us about. It was difficult. Eating was a major, major event. And for Jews, eating in memory of Jesus, for Jews, that carried overtones of the Passover, as I just said. The memories of Jesus' Last Supper before his death would have strengthened that connection and opened up the insight that Jesus himself is the Lamb offered for the liberation of his people, as John makes clear. Gentiles would have come to the table, as I said earlier, with a kind of perhaps a symposium-like understanding. By the way, this is a picture of a meal. You'll notice the reclining, feasting context, and of course, that requires slaves to serve. If this is how you imagine a special meal, you can imagine the tension between what you bring from your culture and what Jesus said, even in Luke 7. By the way, if you get invited to a dinner, don't go lie close to the host. Rather get invited up. There are all kinds of ways in which the social realities of the time are impacting how the vulnerabilities of this of how the Lord's Supper is celebrated. Sometimes we might think that the sort of identifying of the Lord's Supper as a special thing, apart from the kind of common meal to which everyone is invited, is a kind of wanting to shrink the boundaries, wanting to sort of draw circles. I suspect that we should at least be open to the fact that it was evangelistic success and not attempting to close ranks that is at the root of the change that we suspect. In other words, it was increasingly urgent as memory is fading, as people who were with Jesus are dying, increasingly urgent to keep the focus on more than just eating, because that just allows the flood of precedent from whether Jewish or Gentile context to determine what you're doing. To keep the focus on more than just eating, reminding them of the new covenant. The broken body, the blood poured out, and thus the cost of the gift of their own individual and communal salvation. Wow. That's a lot of freight, isn't it? That's what this is in do this in memory of me. This is koinonia with each other, but made possible through our koinonia with God through Christ. The Lord's Supper then becomes a concentrated instance of remembering and reenacting the incarnation, the enfleshment of the divine, taking in the heavenly food, the manna from heaven, and enabling us to put on the apron and become servants as he did. So, in conclusion, 3-4 minutes. How does that help us answer the question we have? One of the questions I know was written down somewhere, is this a sacrament? Well, if by sacrament we think that the it are the elements that somehow effect grace, regardless of our intentions and dispositions, then in our Anabaptist tradition we have said no. Here we learned something from Zwingli. But we might say yes to sacramental language in the following sense. In the first century and in the second century, the word sacramentum was an oath a soldier took to the emperor. So if we think of sacrament as promise, then the Lord's Supper becomes God's promise to us in the new covenant. And it becomes our promise to God to be loyal to what it means to be part of the new covenant. So, interestingly, there might just be a good Anabaptist way of using the word sacrament that connects us with God, but also with the deep, deep commitment we sense from Jesus about actually following him in life. And what about the Lord's Supper in terms of eating with any and all? I don't think that's quite as easy as it is to respond to the term sacrament. In restricting access to baptized believers, we might ask, did the church betray its Lord? Does a bounded, you might say, celebration of the Lord's Supper represent yet another instance of how easy it is for us to forget not only our Lord, but what he was like? I think we have more of a chance to think this thing through if we don't use words like open, inclusive, non-discriminatory, but rather invitational, evangelistic. Maybe those terms work better because they carry within them the promise of challenge and transformation associated with grace. So what do we do? You know, years ago in naming the sheep, I suggested that we have two suppers. Some of you may remember that. I know that in 2006, John Rempel gave a paper at AMBS in which he proposed the same thing. The potluck. I think that's a very, very inadequate term. At our church, First Mennonite Church, we have a potluck committee. What if it were the Agape Committee? Or the Grace Buffet Committee? I'm sure there are better terms than that. I think we need a moment like the Lord's Supper, and boy, do we need to enhance that moment, in which each of us gets to ask the question that we read about in the Gospels of the Last Supper. Is it I? Is it I? In which we are pushed to ask the question about our loyalties to Jesus as those who have been baptized, each time with deep and profound seriousness. But we need just as much, the opportunity to celebrate the open hospitality of Jesus to the multitudes. And we do that, only we call it potluck. What if we educated ourselves to see that as a sacramental moment? The presence of Christ is present in the Lord's Supper, and the presence of Christ is there in the potluck. Now, I don't know whether John, I don't know what your experience has been. There haven't been any takers for that suggestion over the years that I'm aware of. But what I'm trying to say to you with this is not that this is necessarily the best way to go. What I'm trying to say is that I do think we need both the seriousness of a covenantal testing, and we need moments to reenact Jesus' care for those who are truly hungry, physically and spiritually, and where we can open our arms to one and all into the embrace of Christ. But those arms need to be attached if you're going to hug strongly. And I think the Lord's Supper, testing us on our covenant, is exactly a way of testing how strong those shoulders are attached. That's the connection between the two. So I'm very much looking forward to your comments because I think at the present moment, when covenantal glue is undergoing serious erosion through the solvents of our culture, when it's terribly easy to abandon the church, along with most other things we've promised to do, when commitment is very, very weak, this is a sociological reality of our moment, we need to put our questions in connection with that and ask, what does it mean at this time in our life as Anabaptists committed to being the church together? What does it mean? What does the challenge of our time represent for the answers we give to how we celebrate communion? And I put this picture up on here because I'm convinced, for the next hours and the next weeks, years, that the risen, it's not just the Jesus we remember, it's the risen Lord who holds his arms over us as we attempt to become faithful. Thank you very much.